Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 14. A New Guide. In spite of Ned Newton's cry, Tom's finger pressed the switch trigger of the electric rifle, for previous experience had taught him that it was sometimes the best thing to awe the natives in out-of-the-way corners of the earth. But the young inventor quickly elevated the muzzle, and the deadly missile went hissing through the air over the head of the native Indian, who, at that moment, stepped from the bush. The man, startled and alarmed, shrank back and was about to run into the jungle whence he had emerged. Small wonder if he had, considering the reception he so unwittingly met with. But Tom, aware of the necessity for making inquiries of one who knew that part of the jungle, quickly called to him. "Hold on," he shouted. "Wait a minute. I didn't mean that. I thought at first you were a tapir or a tiger. No harm intended. I say, Professor," Tom called back to the savant, "you'd better speak to him in his lingo. I can't manage it. He may be useful, guiding us to that Indian village Jacinto told us of." This Professor Bumper did, being able to make himself understood in the queer part Spanish dialect used by the native Hondurans, though he could not, of course, speak it as fluently as had Jacinto. Professor Bumper had made only a few remarks to the man who had so unexpectedly appeared out of the jungle, when the scientist gave an exclamation of surprise at some of the answers made. "Bless my moving picture!" cried Mr. Damon. "What's the matter now? Is anything wrong? Does he refuse to help us?" "No, it isn't that," was the answer. "In fact, he came here to help us. Tom, this is the brother of the Indian who fell overboard and who was eaten by the alligators. He says you were very kind to try to save his brother with your rifle, and for that reason he has come back to help us." "Come back?" queried Tom. "Yes, he went off with the rest of the Indians when Jacinto deserted us, but he could not stand being a traitor after you had tried to save his brother's life. These Indians are queer people. They don't show much emotion, but they have deep feelings. This one says he will devote himself to your service from now on. I believe we can count on him. He is deeply grateful to you, Tom. I'm glad of all that for our sakes. But what does he say about Jacinto?" The professor asked some more questions, receiving answers, and then translated them. "This Indian, whose name is Tolpec, says Jacinto is a fraud," exclaimed Professor Bumper. "He made all the Indians leave us in the night, though many of them were willing to stay and fill the contract they had made. But Jacinto would not let them, making them desert. Tolpec went away with the others, but because of what Tom had done, he planned to come back at the first chance and be our guide. Accordingly, he jumped ashore from one of the canoes and made his way to our camp. He got there, found it deserted, and followed us, coming up just now." "Well, I'm glad I didn't frighten him off with my gun," remarked Tom grimly. "So he agrees with us that Jacinto is a scoundrel, does he? I guess he might as well classify Professor Beecher in the same way." "I'm not quite so sure of that," said Professor Bumper slowly. "I cannot believe Beecher would play such a trick as this, though some overzealous friend of his might." "Oh, of course Beecher did it," cried Tom. "He heard we were coming here, figured out that we'd start ahead of him, and he wanted to sidetrack us. Well, he did it all right," and Tom's voice was bitter. "He has only sidetracked us for a while," announced Professor Bumper in cheerful tones. "What do you mean?" asked Mr. Damon. "I mean that this Indian comes just in the nick of time. He is well acquainted with this part of the jungle, having lived here all his life, and he offers to guide us to a place where we can get mules to transport ourselves and our baggage to Copan." "Fine!" cried Ned. "When can we start?" Once more the professor and the native conversed in the strange tongue, and then Professor Bumper announced, "He says it will be better for us to go back where we left our things and camp there. He will stay with us tonight, and in the morning go on to the nearest Indian town and come back with porters and helpers." "I think that is good advice to follow," put in Tom, "for we do need our goods, and if we reached the settlement ourselves we would have to send back for our things, with the uncertainty of getting them all." So it was agreed that they would make a forced march back through the jungle to where they had been deserted by Jacinto. There they would make camp for the night, and until such time as Tolpec could return with a force of porters. It was not easy, that backward tramp through the jungle, especially as night had fallen, but the new Indian guide could see like a cat and led the party along paths they never could have found by themselves. The use of their pocket electric lights was a great help, and possibly served to ward off the attacks of jungle beasts, for as they tramped along they could hear stealthy sounds in the underbrush on either side of the path, as though tigers were stalking them. For there was in the woods an animal of the leopard family, called tiger or tigre by the natives, that was exceedingly fierce and dangerous. But watchfulness prevented any accident, and eventually the party reached the place where they had left their goods. Nothing had been disturbed, and finally a fire was made, the tent set up, and a light meal, with hot tea served. "We'll get ahead of Beecher yet," said Tom. "You seem as anxious as Professor Bumper," observed Mr. Damon. "I guess I am," admitted Tom. "I want to see that idol of gold in the possession of our party." The night passed without incident, and then, telling his new friends that he would return as soon as possible with help, Tolpec, taking a small supply of food with him, set out through the jungle again. As the green vines and creepers closed after him, and the explorers were left alone with their possessions piled around them, Ned remarked, "After all, I wonder if it was wise to let him go." "Why not?" asked Tom. "Well, maybe he only wanted to get us back here, and then he'll desert too. Maybe that's what he's done now, making us lose 2 or 3 days by inducing us to return, waiting for what will never happen, his return with other natives." A silence followed Ned's intimation. Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 15. In the Coils. "Ned, do you really think Tolpec is going to desert us?" asked Tom. "Well, I don't know," was the slowly given reply. "It's a possibility, isn't it?" "Yes, it is," broke in Professor Bumper. "But what if it is? We might as well trust him, and if he proves true, as I believe he will, we'll be so much better off. If he proves a traitor, we'll only have lost a few days. For if he doesn't come back, we can go on again in the same way we started." "But that's just it," complained Tom. "We don't want to lose any time with that Beecher chap on our trail." "I'm not so very much concerned about him," remarked Professor Bumper dryly. "Why not?" snapped out Mr. Damon. "Well, because I think he'll have just about as hard work locating the hidden city and finding the idol of gold as we'll have. In other words, it will be an even thing, unless he gets too far ahead of us or keeps us back, and I don't believe he can do that now. So I thought it best to take a chance with this Indian. He would hardly have taken the trouble to come all the way back and run the risks as he did just to delay us a few days. However, we'll soon know. Meanwhile, we'll take it easy and wait for the return of Tolpec and his friends." Though none of them liked to admit it, Ned's words had caused the 3 friends some anxiety, and though they busied themselves about the camp, there was an air of waiting impatiently for something to occur, and waiting is about the hardest work there is. But there was nothing for it but to wait. And it might be at least a week, Professor Bumper said, before the Indian could return with a party of porters and mules to move their baggage. "Yes, Tolpec has not only to locate the settlement," Tom admitted, "but he must persuade the natives to come back with him. We may have trouble in that, especially if it is known that he has left Wasinto, who I imagine is a power among the tribes here." But there were only 2 things left to do, wait and hope. The travelers did both. 4 days passed, and there was no sign of Tolpec. Eagerly, and not a little anxiously, they watched the jungle path along which he had disappeared. "Oh, come on," exclaimed Tom one morning, when the day seemed a bit cooler than its predecessor. "Let's go for a hunt, or something. I'm tired of sitting around camp." "Bless my watch hand, so am I," cried Mr. Damon. "Let's all go for a trip. It'll do us good." "And perhaps I can get some specimens of interest," added Professor Bumper, who, in addition to being an archaeologist, was something of a naturalist. Accordingly, having made everything snug in camp, The party, Tom and Ned equipped with electric rifles, and the Professor with a butterfly net and specimen boxes, set forth. Mr. Damon said he would carry a stout club as his weapon. The jungle, as usual, was teeming with life, but as Ned and Tom did not wish to kill wantonly, they refrained from shooting until later in the day, for once it was dead, game did not keep well in the hot climate, and needed to be cooked almost immediately. "We'll try some shots on our back trip," said the young inventor. Professor Bumper found plenty of his own particular kind of game, which he caught in a net, transferring the specimens to the boxes he carried. There were beautiful butterflies, moths, and strange bugs, in the securing of which the scientist evinced great delight, though when one beetle nipped him firmly and painfully on his thumb, his involuntary cry of pain was as real as that of any other person. "But it didn't let him get away," he said in triumph, when he had dropped the clawing insect into the cyanide bottle where death came painlessly. "It is well worth a sore thumb." They wandered on through the jungle, taking care not to get too far from their camp, for they did not want to lose their way, nor did they want to be absent too long in case Tolpec and his native friends should return. "Well, it's about time we shot something, I think," remarked Ned, when they had been out about 2 hours. "Let's try for some of these wild turkeys. They ought to go well roasted even if it isn't Thanksgiving." "I'm with you," agreed Tom. "Let's see who has the best luck. But tone down the charge in your rifle, and use a smaller projectile, or you will have nothing but a bunch of feathers to show for your shot. The guns are loaded for deer." The change was made, and once more the two young men started off, a little ahead of Professor Bumper and Mr. Damon. Tom and Ned had not gone far, however, before they heard a strange cry from Mr. Damon.
"Tom, Ned!" shouted the eccentric man. "There's a monster after me. Come quick!"
"A tiger!" ejaculated Tom as he began once more to change the charge in his rifle to a larger one, running back, meanwhile, in the direction of the sound of the voice. There were really no tigers in Honduras, the jaguar being called a tiger by the natives, while the cougar is called a lion. The presence of these animals, often dangerous to man, had been indicated around camp, and it was possible that one had been bold enough to attack Mr. Damon, not through hunger, but because of being cornered. "Come on, Ned," cried Tom. "He's in some sort of trouble." But when a moment later the young inventor burst through a fringe of bushes and saw Mr. Damon standing in a little clearing with upraised club, Tom could not repress a laugh.
"Kill it, Tom, kill it," begged the eccentric man. "Bless my insurance policy, but it's a terrible beast."
And so it was at first glance, for it was a giant iguana, one of the most repulsive-looking of the lizards, not unlike an alligator in shape, with spikes on its head and tail, with a warty, squatty, ridge-encrusted body, a big pouch beneath its chin, and long-toed claws. It was enough to strike terror into the heart of almost anyone. Even the smaller ones looked dangerous, and this one, which was about 5 feet long, looked capable of attacking a man and injuring him. As a matter of fact, the iguanas are harmless, their shape and coloring being designed to protect them. "Don't be afraid, Mr. Damon," called Tom, still laughing. "It won't hurt you."
"I'm not so positive of that. It won't let me pass."
"Just take your club and poke it out of the way," the young inventor advised. "It's only waiting to be shoved."
"Then you do it, Tom. Bless my looking-glass, but I don't want to go near it. If my wife could see me now, she'd say it served me just right."
Mr. Damon was not a coward, but the giant iguana was not pleasant to look at. Tom, with the butt of his rifle, gave it a gentle shove, whereupon the creature scurried off through the brush, as though glad to make its escape unscathed.
"I thought it was a new kind of alligator,"
said Mr. Damon with a sigh of relief. "Where is it?" asked Professor Bumper, coming up at this juncture. "A new species of alligator? Let me see it."
"It's too horrible," said Mr. Damon. "I never want to see one again. It was worse than a vampire bat."
Notwithstanding this, when he heard that it was one of the largest-sized iguanas ever seen, the professor started through the jungle after it. "We can't take it with us if we get it," Tom called after his friend. "We might take the skin," answered the professor. "I have a standing order for such things from one of the museums I represent. I'd like to get it." "Then they are often eaten." We can have a change of diet, you see." "We'd better follow him," said Tom to Ned. "We'll have to let the turkeys go for a while. He may get into trouble. Come on." Off they started through the jungle, trailing after the impetuous professor, who was intent on capturing the iguana. The giant lizard's progress could be traced by the disturbance of the leaves and underbrush, and the professor was following as closely as possible. So fast did he go that Ned, Tom, and Mr. Damon, following, lost sight of him several times, and finally Tom called, "Wait a minute. We'll all be lost if you keep this up." "I'll have him in another minute," answered the professor. "I can almost reach him now. Then, oh!" His voice ended in a scream that seemed to be one of terror. So sudden was the change that Tom and Ned, who were together ahead of Mr. Damon, looked at one another in fear. "What has happened?" whispered Ned, pausing. "Don't stop to ask. Come on," shouted Tom. At that instant again came the voice of the savant. "Tom, Ned," he gasped rather than cried. "I'm caught in the coils. Quick, quick, if you would save me." "In the coils," repeated Ned. "What does that mean? Can the giant iguana—" Tom Swift did not stop to answer. With his electric rifle in readiness, he leaped forward through the jungle. Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 16. A Meeting in the Jungle. Before Tom and Ned reached the place where Professor Bumper had called, they heard strange noises other than the imploring voice of their friend. It seemed as though some great body was threshing about in the jungle, lashing the trees, bushes, and leaves about. And when the two young men, followed by Mr. Damon, reached the scene, they saw that, in a measure, this really accounted for what they heard. Something like a great whip was beating about close to two trees that grew near together, and then when the storm of twigs, leaves, and dirt caused by the leaping, thrashing things ceased for a moment, the onlookers saw something that filled them with terror. Between the two trees, and seemingly bound to them by a great coiled rope, spotted and banded, was the body of Professor Bumper. His arms were pinioned to his sides, and there was horror and terror on his face that looked imploringly at the youths from above the topmost coil of those encircling him. "What is it?" cried Mr. Damon as he ran pantingly up. "What has caught him? Is it the giant iguana?" "No, it's a snake, a great boa," gasped Tom. "It has him in its coils, but it is wound around the trees, too. That alone prevents it from crushing the professor to death. Ned, be ready with your rifle. Put in the heaviest charge, and watch your chance to fire." The great ugly head of the boa reared itself up from the coils which it had, with the quickness of thought, thrown about the man between the two trees. This species of snake is not poisonous. It kills its prey by crushing it to death, making it into a pulpy mass, with scarcely a bone left unbroken, after which it swallows its meal. The crushing power of one of these boas, some of which reach a length of 30 feet, with a body as large around as that of a full-grown man, is enormous. "I'm going to fire suddenly," cried Tom. He had seen his chance, and he took it. There was the faint report, the crack of the electric rifle, and the folds of the serpent seemed to relax. "I see a good chance now," added Ned, who had taken the small charge from his weapon, replacing it with a heavier one. His rifle was also discharged in the direction of the snake, and Tom saw that the hit was a good one, right through the ugly head of the reptile. "One other will be enough to make him loosen his coils," cried Tom, as he fired again, and such was the killing power of the electric bullets that the snake, though an immense one, and one that, short of decapitation, could have received many injuries without losing power, seemed to shrivel up. Its folds relaxed, and the coils of the great body fell in a heap at the roots of the two trees, between which the scientist had been standing. Professor Bumper seemed to fall backward as the grip of the serpent relaxed, but Tom, dropping his rifle and calling to Ned to keep an eye on the snake, leaped forward and caught his friend. "Are you hurt?" asked Tom, carrying the limp form over to a grassy place. There was no answer. The savant's eyes were closed, and he breathed but faintly. Ned Newton fired 2 more electric bullets into the still writhing body of the boa. "I guess he's all in," he called to Tom.
"Bless my horseradish, and so our friend seems to be," commented Mr. Damon. "Have you anything with which to revive him, Tom?"
"Yes, some ammonia. See if you can find a little water."
"I have some in my flask."
Tom mixed a dose of the spirits which he carried with him, and this, forced between the pallid lips of the scientist, revived him.
"Oh, what happened?"
he asked faintly as he opened his eyes.
"Oh, yes, I remember,"
he added slowly. "The boa." "Don't try to talk," urged Tom. "You're all right. The snake is dead, or dying. Are you much hurt?" Professor Bumper appeared to be considering. He moved first one limb, then another. He seemed to have the power over all his muscles. "I see how it happened," he said, as he sat up after taking a little more of the ammonia. "I was following the iguana, and then the big lizard came to a stop in a little hollow place in the ground at the foot of those 2 trees. I leaned over to slip a noose or rope around its neck. Then I felt myself caught, as if in the hands of a giant, and bound fast between the 2 trees. It was the big boa that whipped itself around you as you leaned over," explained Tom, as Ned came up to announce that the snake was no longer dangerous. "But when it coiled around you, it also coiled around the 2 trees, you fortunately slipping between them. Had it not been that their trunks took off some of the pressure of the coils, you wouldn't have lasted a minute."
"Well, I was pretty badly squeezed as it was," remarked the professor.
"I hardly had breath enough left to call to you. I tried to fight off the serpent, but it was no use."
"I should say not," cried Mr. Damon. "Bless my circus ring, one might as well try to combat an elephant. But, my dear Professor, are you all right now?"
"I think so, yes, though I shall be lame and stiff for a few days, I fear. I can hardly walk." Professor Bumper was indeed unable to go about much for a few days after his encounter with the great serpent. He stretched out in a hammock under trees in the camp clearing, and with his friends waited for the possible return of Tolpec and the Porters. Ned and Tom made 1 or 2 short hunting trips, and on these occasions they kept a lookout in the direction the Indian had taken when he went away. "For he's sure to come back that way, if he comes at all," declared Ned, "which I am beginning to doubt." "Well, he may not come," agreed Tom, who was beginning to lose some of his first hope. "But he won't necessarily come from the same direction he took. He may have had to go in an entirely different way to get help. We'll hope for the best." A week passed. Professor Bumper was able to be about, and Tom and Ned noticed that there was an anxious look on his face. Was he, too, beginning to despair?
"Well, this isn't hunting for golden idols very fast,"
said Mr. Damon the morning of the 8th day after their desertion by the faithless Washington. "What do you say, Professor Bumper? Ought we not to start off on our own account?" "We had better, if Tolpec does not return today," was the answer. They had eaten breakfast, had put their camp in order, and were about to have a consultation on what was best to do, when Tom suddenly called to Ned, who was whistling. "Hark!" Through the jungle came a faint sound of singing, not a harmonious air, but the somewhat barbaric chant of the natives.
"It's Tolpec coming back!" cried Mr. Damon. "Hooray! Now our troubles are over. Bless my meal ticket. Now we can start."
"It may be Washington," suggested Ned.
"Nonsense, you old cold water pitcher," cried Tom. "It's Tolpec. I can see him. He's a good scout, all right."
And then, walking at the head of a band of Indians who were weirdly chanting, while behind them came a train of mules with Tolpec, a cheerful grin covering his honest, if homely, dark face.
"We come back,"
he exclaimed in guttural English, using about half of his foreign vocabulary. "I see you did," answered Professor Bumper in the man's own tongue. "Glad to see you. Is everything all right?" "All right," was the answer. "These Indians will take you where you want to go, and will not leave you as Watinko did." "We'll start in the morning," exclaimed the savant, his own cheerful self again, now that there was a prospect of going further into the interior. "Tell the men to get something to eat, Tolpec. There is plenty for all." Good," grunted the new guide, and soon the hungry Indians, who had come far, were satisfying their hunger. As they ate, Tolpec explained to Professor Bumper, who repeated it to the youth and Mr. Damon, that it had been necessary to go further than he had intended to get the porters and mules, but the Indians were a friendly tribe, of which he was a member, and could be depended on. There was a feast and a sort of celebration in camp that night. Tom and Ned shot 2 deer, and these formed the main part of the feast, and the Indians made merry about the fire until nearly midnight. They did not seem to mind in the least the swarms of mosquitoes and other bugs that flew about, attracted by the light. As for Tom Swift and his friends, their nets protected them. An early start was made the following morning. Such packages of goods and supplies as could not be well carried by the Indians in their head straps were loaded on the backs of the pack mules. Tolpec explained that on reaching the Indian village, where he had secured the porters, they could get some ox carts, which would be a convenience in traveling into the interior toward Copan Valley. The march onward for the next 2 days was tiresome, but the Indians Tolpec had secured were as faithful and as efficient as he had described them, and good progress was made. There were a few accidents. One native fell into a swiftly running stream as they were fording it and lost a box containing some much-needed things. But as the man's life was saved, Professor Bumper said it made up for the other loss. Another accident did not end so auspiciously. One of the bearers was bitten by a poisonous snake, and though prompt measures were taken, the poison spread so rapidly that the man died. In due season the Indian village was reached, where, after a day spent in holding funeral services over the dead bearer, preparations were made for proceeding further. This time some of the bearers were left behind, and ox carts were substituted for them, as it was possible to carry more goods this way. "And now we're really off to Copan," exclaimed Professor Bumper one morning, when the cavalcade, led by Tolpec in the capacity of head guide, started off. "I hope we have no more delays." "I hope not either," agreed Tom. "That Beecher may be ahead of us." Weary marchers fell to their portion. There were mountains to climb, streams to ford or swim, sending the carts over on rudely made rafts. There were storms to endure, and the eternal heat to fight. But finally the party emerged from the lowlands of the coast and went up in among the hills, where, though the going was harder, the climate was better. It was not so hot and moist. Not wishing to attract attention in Copan itself, Professor Bumper and his party made a detour, and finally, after much consultation with Tom over the ancient maps, the scientist announced that he thought they were in the vicinity of the buried city. "We will begin test excavations in the morning," he said. The party was in camp, and preparations were made for spending the night in the forest, when from among the trees there floated to the ears of our friends a queer Indian chant. "Someone is coming," said Tom to Ned. Almost as he spoke, there filed into the clearing where the camp had been set up a cavalcade of white men, followed by Indians, and at the sight of one of the white men Tom Swift uttered a cry. "Professor Beecher!" gasped the young inventor. Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 17. The Lost Map. The on-marching company of white men with their Indian attendants came to a halt on the edge of the clearing as they caught sight of the tents already set up there. The barbaric chant of the native bearers ceased abruptly, and there was a look of surprise shown on the face of Professor Fenimore Beecher, for Professor Beecher it was, in the lead of the rival expedition. "Bless my shoelaces!" exclaimed Mr. Damon. "Is it really Beecher?" asked Ned, though he knew as well as Tom that it was the young archaeologist. "It certainly is," declared Tom, "and he has the nerve to follow us so closely." "Maybe he thinks we have the nerve to get ahead of him here," suggested Ned, smiling grimly. "Probably," agreed Tom, with a short laugh. "Well, it evidently surprises him to find us here at all, after the mean trick he played on us to get Juanito to lead us into the jungle and desert us." "That's right," asserted Ned. "Well, what's the next move?" There seemed to be some doubt about this on the part of both expeditions. At the sight of Professor Beecher, Professor Bumper, who had come out of his tent, hurriedly turned to Tom and asked him what he thought it best to do.
"Do?" exclaimed the eccentric Mr. Damon, not giving Tom time to reply. "Why, stand your ground, of course, bless my house and lot. But we're here first. For the matter of that, I suppose the jungle is free, and we can no more object to his coming here than he can to our coming. First come, first served, I suppose, is the law of the forest."
Meanwhile, the surprise occasioned by the unexpected meeting of the rivals seemed to have spread something like consternation among the white members of the Beecher party. As for the natives, they evidently did not care one way or the other. There was a hasty consultation among the professors accompanying Mr. Beecher, and then the latter himself advanced toward the tents of Tom and his friends and asked, "How long have you been here?" "I don't see that we are called upon to answer that question," replied Professor Bumper stiffly. "Perhaps not, and yet—" "There is no perhaps about it," said Professor Bumper quickly. "I know what your object is, as I presume you do mine, and after what I may term your disgraceful and unsportsmanlike conduct toward me and my friends, I prefer not to have anything further to do with you. We must meet as strangers hereafter." "Very well." And Professor Beecher's voice was as cold and uncompromising as was his rival's. "Let it be your wish, but I must say I don't know what you mean by unsportsmanlike conduct." "An explanation would be wasted on you," said Professor Bumper stiffly. "But in order that you may know I fully understand what you did, I will say that your efforts to thwart us through your tool, Juantico, came to nothing. We are here ahead of you." "Juantico!" cried Professor Beecher in real or simulated surprise. "Why, he was not my tool, as you term it." "Your denial is useless in the light of his confession," asserted Professor Bumper. "Confession?" "Now, look here," exclaimed the older professor, "I do not propose to lower myself by quarreling with you. I know certainly what you and your party tried to do to prevent us from getting here. But we got out of the trap you set for us, and we are on the ground first. I recognize your right to make explorations as well as ourselves, and I presume you have not fallen too low that you will not recognize the unwritten law in a case of this kind, the law which says the right of discovery belongs to the one who first makes it." "I shall certainly abide by such conduct as is usual under the circumstances," said Professor Beecher more stiffly than before. "At the same time, I must deny having set a trap, and as for Juantico—" "It will be useless to discuss it further," broke in Professor Bumper. "Then no more need be said," retorted the younger man. "I shall give orders to my friends as well as to the natives to keep away from your camp, and I shall expect you to do the same regarding mine." "I should have suggested the same thing myself," came from Tom's friend, and the two rival scientists fairly glared at one another, the others of both parties looking on with interest. Professor Bumper turned and walked defiantly back to his tent. Professor Beecher did the same thing. Then, after a short consultation among the white members of the latter's organization, their tents were set up in another clearing, removed and separated by a screen of trees and bushes from those of Tom Swift's friends. The natives of the Beecher party also withdrew a little way from those of Professor Bumper's organization, and then preparations for spending the night in the jungle went on in the rival headquarters. "Well, he certainly had nerve to deny practically that he had set Juantico up to do what he did," commented Tom. "I should say so," agreed Ned. "How do you imagine he got here nearly as soon as we did, when he did not start until later?" asked Mr. Damon. "He did not have the unfortunate experience of being deserted in the jungle," replied Tom. "He probably had Juantico or some of that unprincipled scoundrel's friends show him a short route to Copan, and he came on from there." "Well, I did hope we might have the ground to ourselves, at least for the preliminary explorations and excavations. But it is not to be. My rival is here," sighed Professor Bumper. "Don't let that discourage you," exclaimed Tom. "We can fight all the better now the foe is in the open,
and we know where he is." "Yes, Tom Swift, that is true," agreed the scientist. "I am not going to give up, but I shall have to change my plans a little. Perhaps you will come into the tent with me." And he nodded to Tom and Ned. "I want to talk over certain matters with you and Mr. Damon." "Please do," assented the young inventor, and his financial secretary nodded. A little later, supper having been eaten, the camp made shipshape, and the natives settled down. Tom, Ned, Mr. Damon, and Professor Bumper assembled in the tent of the scientist, where a dry battery lamp gave sufficient illumination to show a number of maps and papers scattered over an improvised table. "Now, gentlemen," said the professor, "I have called you here to go over my plans more in detail than I have hitherto done. Now we are on the ground. You know in a general way what I hope to accomplish, but the time has come when I must be specific. Aside from being on the spot below which, or below the vicinity where I believe lies the lost city of Curzon and, I hope, the idol of gold, a situation has arisen, an unexpected situation, I may say, which calls for different action from what I had counted on. I refer to the presence of my rival, Professor Beecher. I will not dwell now on what he has done. It is better to consider what he may do." "That's right," agreed Ned. "He may get up in the night, dig up this city, and skip with the golden image before we know it." "Hardly," grinned Tom. "No," said Professor Bumper. "Excavating buried cities in the jungle of Honduras is not as simple as that. There is much work to be done, but accidents may happen, and in case one should occur to me, and I am unable to prosecute the search, I want one of you to do it. For that reason, I am going to show you the maps and ancient documents and point out to you where I believe the lost city lies. Now, if you will give me your attention, I'll proceed." The professor went over in detail the story of how he had found the old documents relating to the lost city of Curzon, and how, after much labor and research, he had located the city in the Copan Valley. The great idol of gold was one of the chief possessions of Curzon, and it was often referred to in the old papers, copies and translations of which the professor had with him. "But this is the most valuable of all," he said, as he opened an oiled silk packet. "And before I show it to you, suppose you two young men take a look outside the tent." "What for?" asked Mr. Damon. "To make sure that no emissaries from the Beecher crowd are sneaking around to overhear what we say," was the somewhat bitter answer of the scientist. "I do not trust him," in spite of his attempted denial. Tom and Ned took a quick but thorough observation outside the tent. The blackness of the jungle night was in strange contrast to the light they had just left. "Doesn't seem to be anyone around here," remarked Ned after waiting a minute or two. "No, all's quiet along the Potomac. Those Beecher natives are having some sort of a song fest, though." In the distance, and from the direction of the rivals' camp, came the weird chant. "Well, as long as they stay there, we'll be all right," said Tom. "Come on in. I'm anxious to hear what the professor has to say." "Everything's quiet," reported Ned. "Then give me your attention," begged the scientist. Carefully, as though about to exhibit some precious jewel, he loosened the oiled silk wrappings and showed a large map on thin but tough paper. "This is drawn from the old charts," the professor explained. "I worked on it many months, and it is the only copy in the world. If it were to be destroyed, I should have to go all the way back to New York to make another copy. I have the original there in a safe deposit vault." "Wouldn't it have been wise to make 2 copies?" asked Tom. "It would have only increased the risk. With 1 copy, and that constantly in my possession, I can be sure of my ground, otherwise not. That is why I am so careful of this. Now I will show you why I believe we are about over the ancient city of Curzon." "Over it?" cried Mr. Damon. "Bless my gunpowder, what do you mean?" And he looked down at the earthen floor of the tent as though expecting it to open and swallow him. "I mean that the city, like many others of Central and South America, is buried below the refuse of centuries," went on the professor. "Very soon, if we are fortunate,
we shall be looking on the civilization of hundreds of years ago. How long, no one knows. Considerable excavation has been done in Central America, went on the professor, and certain ruins have been brought to light. Near us are those of Copan, while toward the frontier are those of Uriqua, which are even better preserved than the former. We may visit them if we have time, but I have reason to believe that in this section of Copan is a large city, the existence of which has not been made certain of by any one save myself, and perhaps Professor Beecher. Certainly no part of it has seen the light of day for many centuries. It shall be our pleasure to uncover it, if possible, and secure the idol of gold. How long do you think the city was buried? Asked Tom. It would be hard to say. From the carvings and hieroglyphics I have studied, it would seem that the Mayan civilization lasted about 500 years, and that it began perhaps in the year A.D. 500.
That would mean, said Mr. Damon, that the ancient cities were in ruins, buried perhaps long before Columbus discovered the New World.
Yes, assented the professor. Probably Curzon, which we now seek, was buried deep for nearly 500 years before Columbus landed at San Salvador. The specimens of writing and architecture heretofore disclosed indicate that. But as a matter of fact, it is very hard to decipher the Mayan pictographs. So far, little but the ability to read their calendars and numerical system is possessed by us, though we are gradually making headway. Now, this is the map of the district, and by the markings you can see where I hope to find what I seek. We shall begin digging here. And he made a small mark with a pencil on the map. Of course, the professor explained, I may be wrong, and it will take some time to discover the error if we make one. When a city is buried 30 or 40 feet deep beneath earth, and great trees have grown over it, it is not easy to dig down to it. How do you ever expect to find it? Asked Ned. Well, we shall sink shafts here and there. If we find carved stone, the remains of ancient pottery and weapons, parts of buildings or building stones, we shall know that we are on the right track, was the answer. And now that I have shown you the map and explained how valuable it is, I will put it away again. We shall begin our excavations in the morning. At what point? Asked Tom. At the point I shall indicate after a further consultation of the map. I must see the configuration of the country by daylight to decide. And now, let's get some rest. We have had a hard day. The two tents housing the 4 white members of the Bumper party were close together, and it was decided that the night should be divided into 4 watches to guard against possible treachery on the part of the Beecher crowd. It seems an unkind precaution to take against a fellow scientist, said Professor Bumper, but I cannot afford to take chances after what has occurred. The others agreed with him, and though standing guard was not pleasant, it was done. However, the night passed without incident. Then came morning and the excitement of getting breakfast, over which the Indians made merry. They did not like the cold and darkness, and always welcomed the sun, no matter how hot. And now, cried Tom, when the meal was over, let us begin the work that has brought us here. Yes, agreed Professor Bumper. I will consult the map and start the diggers, where I think the city lies, far below the surface. Now, gentlemen, if you will give me your attention. He was seeking through his outer coat pockets after an ineffectual search in the inner one. A strange look came over his face. What's the matter? Asked Tom. The map, gasped the professor. The map I was showing you last night. The map that tells where we are to dig for the idol of gold. It's gone.
Map is gone?
Gasped Mr. Damon. I'm afraid so, faltered the professor. I put it away carefully, but now... He ceased speaking to make a further search in all his pockets. Maybe you left it in another coat, suggested Ned. Or maybe someone of the Beecher crowd took it, snapped Tom. Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 18, El Tigre. The 4 men gazed at one another. Consternation showed on the face of Professor Bumper, and was reflected more or less on the countenances of his companions. "Are you sure the map is gone?" asked Tom. "I know how easy it is to mislay anything in a camp of this sort. I couldn't at first find my safety razor this morning, and when I did locate it, the hole was in one of my shoes. I'm sure a rat or some jungle animal must have dragged it there. Now maybe they took your map, Professor. That oiled silk in which it was wrapped might have appealed to the taste of a rat or a snake." "It is no joking matter," said Professor Bumper, "but I know how you appreciate the seriousness of it as much as I do, Tom. But I had the map in the pocket of this coat, and now it's gone." "When did you put it there?" asked Ned. "This morning, just before I came to breakfast." "Oh, then you have had it since last night," Tom ejaculated. "Yes, I slept with it under my clothes that I rolled up for a pillow, and when it was my turn to stand guard I took it with me. Then I put it back again and went to sleep. When I awoke and dressed I put the packet in my pocket and ate breakfast. Now when I look for it, why, it's gone." "The map or the oiled silk package?" asked Mr. Damon, who, once having been a businessman, was sometimes a stickler for small points. "Both," answered the professor. "I opened the silk to tie it more securely, so it would not be such a lump in my pocket, and I made sure the map was inside." "Then the whole thing has been taken, or you have lost it," suggested Ned. "I am not in the habit of losing valuable maps," retorted the scientist, "and the pocket of my coat I had made deep for the purpose of carrying the long map. It could not drop out." "Well, we mustn't overlook any possible chances," suggested Tom. "Come on now. We'll search every inch of the ground over which you traveled this morning, Professor." "It must be found," murmured the scientist. "Without it all our work will go for naught." They all went into the tent where the professor and Mr. Damon had slept when they were not on guard. The camp was very busy, with the Indians finishing their morning meal and getting ready for the work of the day, for word had been given out that there would be no more long periods of travel. In consequence, efforts were being directed by the head man of the bearers to make a more permanent camp in the wilderness. Shelters of palm-thatched huts were being built, a site for cooking fires made, and, at the direction of Mr. Damon, to whom this part was entrusted, some sanitary regulations were insisted on. Leaving the busy scene, the four, with solemn faces, proceeded to the tent, where it was hoped the map would be found. But though they went through everything and traced and retraced every place the professor could remember having traversed about the canvas shelter, no signs of the important document could be found. "I don't believe I dropped it out of my pocket," said the scientist for perhaps the 20th time. "Then it was taken," declared Tom. "That's what I say," chimed in Ned, "and by some of Beecher's party."
"Easy, my boy," cautioned Mr. Damon. "We don't want to make accusations we can't prove."
"That is true," agreed Professor Bumper. "But though I am sorry to say it of a fellow archaeologist, I cannot help thinking Beecher had something to do with the taking of my map."
"But how could any of them get it?" asked Mr. Damon. "You say you had the map this morning, and certainly none of them has been in our camp since dawn, though of course it is possible that some of them sneaked in during the night."
"It does seem a mystery how it could have been taken in open daylight, while we were about camp together," said Tom. "But is the loss such a grave one, Professor Bumper?" "Very grave. In fact, I may say it is impossible to proceed with the excavating without the map." "Then what are we to do?" asked Ned. "We must get it back," declared Tom. "Yes," agreed the scientist, "we cannot work without it. As soon as I make a little further search to make sure it could not have dropped in some out-of-the-way place, I shall go over to Professor Beecher's camp and demand that he give me back my property." "Suppose he says he hasn't taken it?" asked Tom. "Well, I'm sure he either took it personally or one of his party did, and yet I can't understand how they could have come here without our seeing them," and the professor shook his head in puzzled despair. A more detailed search did not reveal the missing map, and Mr. Damon and his friend the scientist were on the point of departing for the camp of the rivals less than a mile away, when Tom had what really amounted to an inspiration. "Look here, Professor," he cried. "Can you remember any of the details of your map? Say, for instance, where we ought to begin excavating to get the wonders of the underground city?" "Well, Tom, I did intend to compare my map with the configuration of the country about here. There's a certain mountain which serves as a landmark and guide for a starting point. I think that is over there," and the scientist pointed to a distant snow-capped peak. The party had left the low, marshy land of the true jungle and were among the foothills, though all about them was dense forest and underbrush, which in reality was as much a jungle as the lower plains, but less wet. "The point where I believe we should start to dig," said the professor, "is near the spot where the top of the mountain casts a shadow when the sun is 1 hour high. At least that is the direction given in the old manuscript. So, though we can do little without the map, we might make a start by digging here." "No, not there," exclaimed Tom. "Why not?" "Because we don't want to let Beecher's crowd know that we are on the track of the idol of gold." "But they know anyhow, for they have the map," commented Ned, puzzled by his chum's words. "Maybe not," said Tom slowly. "I think this is a time for a big bluff. It may work and it may not. Beecher's crowd either has the map or they have not. If they have it, they will lose no time in trying to find the right place to start digging, and then they'll begin excavating." "Very good. If they do that, we have a right to dig near the same place. But if they have not the map, which is possible, and if we start to dig where the professor's memory tells him is the right spot, we'll only give them the tip, and they'll dig there also." "I'm sure they have the map," the professor said, "but I believe our plan is a good one, Tom." "Just what do you propose doing?" asked Ned. "Fooling 'em," exclaimed Tom quickly. "We'll dig in some place remote from the spot where the mountain casts its shadow. They will think, if they haven't the map, that we are proceeding by it, and they'll dig too. When they find nothing, as also happens to us, they may go away. If, on the other hand, they have the map and see us digging at a spot not indicated on it, they will be puzzled, knowing we must have some idea of where the buried city lies. They will think the map is at fault, perhaps, and not make use of it. Then we can get it back." "Bless my hat, man," cried Mr. Damon. "I believe you're right, Tom. We'll dig in the wrong place to fool 'em." And this was done. Search for the precious map was given up for the time being, and the professor and his friends set the natives to work digging shafts in the ground, as though sinking them down to the level of the buried city. But though this false work was prosecuted with vigor for several days, there was a feeling of despair among the Bumper party over the loss of the map. "If we could only get it back!" exclaimed the professor again and again. Meanwhile, the Beecher party seemed inactive. True, some members of it did come over to look on from a respectful distance at what the diggers were doing. Some of the rival helpers, under the direction of the head of the expedition, also began sinking shafts, but they were not in the locality remembered by Professor Bumper as being correct. "I can't imagine what they're up to," he said. "If they have my map, they would act differently, I should think." "Whatever they're up to," answered Tom, "the time has come when we can dig at the place where we can hope for results." And the following day shafts were started in the shadow of the mountain, until some evidence could have been obtained by digging as to the location beneath the surface of a buried city. There was nothing for the travelers to do but wait. Turns were taken in directing the efforts of the diggers, and an occasional inspection was made of the shafts. "What do you expect to find first?" asked Tom of Professor Bumper one day, when the latter was at the top of a shaft waiting for a bucket load of dirt to be hoisted up. "Pot shreds and artifacts," was the answer. "What sort of bugs are they?" asked Ned with a laugh. He and Tom were about to go hunting with their electric rifles. "Artifacts are things made by the Indians, or whatever members of the race who built the ancient cities were called, such as household articles, vases, ornaments, tools, and so on. Anything made by artificial means is called an artifact." "And potsherds are things with those Chinese laundry ticket scratches on them," added Tom. "Exactly," said the professor, laughing, "though some of the strange-appearing inscriptions give much valuable information. As soon as we find some of them, say a broken bit of pottery with hieroglyphics on, I will know that I am on the right track." And while the scientist and Mr. Damon kept watch at the top of the shaft, Tom and Ned went out into the jungle to hunt. They had killed some game and were stalking a fine big deer which would provide a feast for the natives, when suddenly the silence of the lonely forest was broken by a piercing scream, followed by an agonized cry.
El Tigre! El Tigre!"
Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 19. Poisoned Arrows.
"Did you hear that, Tom?" asked Ned in a hoarse whisper. "Surely," was the cautious answer. "Keep still, and I'll try for a shot." "Better be quick," advised Ned in a tense voice. "The chap who did that yelling seems to be in trouble." And as Ned's voice trailed off into a whisper, again came the cry, this time in frenzied pain. "El Tigre! El Tigre!" Then there was a jumble of words. "It's over this way." And this time Ned shouted, seeing no need for low voices, since the other was so loud. Tom looked to where Ned had parted the bushes alongside a jungle path. Through the opening the young inventor saw, in a little glade, that which caused him to take a firmer grip on his electric rifle, and also a firmer grip on his nerves. Directly in front of him and Ned, and not more than 100 yards away, was a great tawny and spotted jaguar, the tigre or tiger of Central America. The beast, with lashing tail, stood over an Indian upon whom it seemed to have sprung from some lair, beating the unfortunate man to the ground. Nor had he fallen scratchless, for there was blood on the green leaves about him, and it was not the blood of the spotted beast. "Oh, Tom, can you—" and Ned faltered. The young inventor understood the unspoken question. "I think I can make a shot of it without hitting the man," he answered, never turning his head. "It's a question, though, if the beast won't claw him in the death struggle. It won't last long, however, if the electric bullet goes to the right place, and I've got to take the chance." Cautiously Tom brought his weapon to bear. Quiet as Ned and he had been after the discovery, the jaguar seemed to feel that something was wrong. Intent on his prey for a time, he had stood over it, gloating. Now the brute glanced uneasily from side to side, its tail nervously twitching, and it seemed trying to gain, by sniffing of the air, some information as to the direction in which danger lay, for Tom and Ned had stooped low, concealing themselves by a screen of leaves. The Indian, after his first frenzied outburst of fear, now lay quiet, as though fearing to move, moaning in pain. Suddenly the jaguar, attracted either by some slight movement on the part of Ned or Tom, or perhaps by having winded them, turned his head quickly and gazed with cruel eyes straight at the spot where the two young men stood behind the bushes. "He sees us," whispered Ned. "Yes," assented Tom, "and it's a perfect shot. Hope I don't miss." It was not like Tom Swift to miss, nor did he on this occasion. There was a slight report from the electric rifle, a report not unlike the crackle of the wireless, and the powerful projectile sped true to its mark. Straight through the throat and chest, under the uplifted jaw of the jaguar it went, through heart and lungs. Then, with a great coughing, sighing snarl, the beast reared up, gave a convulsive leap forward towards its newly discovered enemies, and fell dead in a limp heap, just beyond the native over which it had been crouching before it delivered the death stroke, now never to fall. "You did it, Tom, you did it!" cried Ned, springing up from where he had been kneeling to give his chum a better chance to shoot. "You did it and saved the man's life." And Ned would have rushed out toward the still twitching body. "Just a minute," interposed Tom. "Those beasts sometimes have as many lives as a cat. I'll give it one more for luck." Another electric projectile through the head of the jaguar produced no further effect than to move the body slightly, and this proved conclusively that there was no life left. It was safe to approach, which Tom and Ned did. Their first thought, after a glance at the jaguar, was for the Indian. It needed but a brief examination to show that he was not badly hurt. The jaguar had leaped on him from a low tree as he passed under it, as the boys learned afterwards, and had crushed the man to earth by the weight of the spotted body, more than by a stroke of the paw. The American jaguar is not so formidable a beast as the native name of tiger would cause one to suppose, though they are sufficiently dangerous, and this one had rather badly clawed the Indian. Fortunately, the scratches were on the fleshy parts of the arms and shoulders, where, though painful, they were not necessarily serious. "But if you hadn't shot when you did, Tom, it would have been all up with him," commented Ned. "Oh, well,
"I guess you'd have hit him if I hadn't," returned the young inventor. "But let's see what we can do for this chap." The man sat up wonderingly, hardly able to believe that he had been saved from the dreaded tigre. His wounds were bleeding rather freely, and as Tom and Ned carried with them a first-aid kit, they now brought it into use. The wounds were bound, the man was given water to drink, and then, as he was able to walk, Tom and Ned offered to help him wherever he wanted to go. "Blessed if I could tell whether he's one of our Indians or whether he belongs to the Beecher crowd," remarked Tom. "Señor Beecher," said the Indian, adding in Spanish that he lived in the vicinity and had only lately been engaged by the young professor, who hoped to discover the idol of gold before Tom's scientific friend could do so. Tom and Ned knew a little Spanish, and with that and simple but expressive signs on the part of the Indian they learned his story. He had his palm-thatched hut not far from the Beecher camp, in a small Indian village, and he with others had been hired on the arrival of the Beecher party to help with the excavations. These, for some reason, were delayed. "Delayed because they daren't use the map they stole from us," commented Ned. "Maybe," agreed Tom. The Indian, whose name it developed was Towle, as nearly as Tom and Ned could master it, had left camp to go to visit his wife and child in the jungle hut, intending to return to the Beecher camp at night. But as he passed through the forest a jaguar had dropped on him, bearing him to earth. "But you saved my life, Señor," he said to Tom, dropping on one knee and trying to kiss Tom's hand, which our hero avoided. "And now my life is yours," added the Indian. "Well, you'd better get home with it and take care of it," said Tom. "I'll have Professor Bumper come over and dress your scratches in a better and more careful way. The bandages we put on are only temporary." "My wife, she make poultice of leaves. They cure me," said the Indian. "I guess that will be the best way," observed Ned. "These natives can doctor themselves for some things better than we can." "Well, we'll take him home," suggested Tom. "He might keel over from loss of blood. Come on," he added to Tall, indicating his object. It was not far to the native's hut from the place where the jaguar had been killed, and there Tom and Ned underwent another demonstration of affection as soon as those of Tall's immediate family and the other natives understood what had happened. "I hate this business," complained Tom, after having been knelt to by the Indian's wife and child, who called him the Preserver, and other endearing titles of the same kind. "Come on, let's hike back." But Indian hospitality, especially after life has been saved, is not so simple as all that. "My life, my house, all that I own is yours," said Tall in deep gratitude. "Take everything." And he waved his hand to indicate all the possessions in his humble hut. "Thanks," answered Tom, "but I guess you'll need all you have. That's a fine specimen of blowgun, though," he added, seeing one hanging on the wall. "I wouldn't mind having one like that, if you get well enough to make one for me, Tall, and some arrows to go with it. I'd like it for a curiosity to hang in my room at home." "The Señor shall have a dozen," promised the Indian. "Look, Ned," went on Tom, pointing to the native weapon. "I never saw one just like this. They use small arrows or darts tipped with wild cotton instead of feathers." "These are arrows," explained Tall's wife, bringing a bundle from a corner of the one-room hut. As she held them out, her husband gave a cry of fear. "Poisoned arrows, poisoned arrows!" he exclaimed. "One scratch, and the Señors are dead men. Put them away." In fear, the Indian wife prepared to obey, but as she did so, Tom Swift caught sight of the package and uttered a strange cry. "Thundering hop-toads, Ned!" he exclaimed. "The poison arrows are wrapped in the piece of oiled silk that was around the professor's missing map." Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 20. An Old Legend. Fascinated, Tom and Ned gazed at the package the Indian woman held out to them. Undoubtedly it was oiled silk on the outside, and through the almost transparent covering could be seen the small arrows or darts used in the blowgun. "Where did you get that?" asked Tom, pointing to the bundle and gazing sternly at Tall. "What is the matter, Señor?" asked the Indian in turn. "Is it that you are afraid of the poisoned arrows? Be assured they will not harm you unless you are scratched by them." Tom and Ned found it difficult to comprehend all the rapid Spanish spoken by their host, but they managed to understand some, and his eloquent gestures made up the rest. "We're not afraid," Tom said, noting that the oiled skin well covered the dangerous darts. "But where did you get that?" "I picked it up after another Indian had thrown it away. He got it in your camp, Senor. I will not lie to you. I did not steal. Valdez went to your camp to steal. He is a bad Indian, and he brought back this wrapping. It contained something that he thought was gold, but it was not. So he—" "Quick, yes, tell us," demanded Tom eagerly. "What did he do with the professor's map that was in the oiled silk? Where is it?" "Oh, senors," exclaimed the Indian woman, thinking perhaps her husband was about to be dealt harshly with when she heard Tom's excited voice. "Tal do no harm?" "No, he did no harm," went on Tom in a reassuring tone, "but he can do a whole lot of good if he tells us what became of the map that was in this oiled silk. Where is it?" he asked again. "Valdez burned it up," answered Tal. "What? Burned up the professor's map?" cried Ned. "If that was in this yellow cloth, yes," answered the injured man. "Valdez, he is bad. He say to me he is going to your camp to see what he can take. How he got this, I know not. But he come back one morning with the yellow package. I see him, but he make me promise not to tell. But you saved my life. I tell you everything. Valdez opened the package, but it is not gold, though he thinks so because it is yellow. And the man with no hair on his head keep it in his pocket close, so close." And Tal hugged himself to indicate what he meant. "That's Professor Bumper," explained Ned. "How did Valdez get the map out of the professor's coat?" asked Tom. "Valdez, he very much smart. When man with no hair on his head take coat off for a minute to eat breakfast, Valdez take yellow thing out of pocket." "The Indian must have sneaked into camp when we were eating," said Tom. "Those from Beecher's party and our workers look all alike to us. We wouldn't know one from the other. And one of our rivals might slip in." "One evidently did, if this is really the piece of oiled silk that was around the professor's map," said Ned. "It certainly is the same," declared the young inventor. "See, there is his name," and he stretched out his hand to point. "Don't touch," cried Tal. "Poisoned arrow, snake poison. Very dead-like and quick." "Don't worry, I won't touch," said Tom grimly. "But go on. You say Valdez sneaked into our camp, took the oiled silk package from the coat pocket of Professor Bumper, and went back to his own camp with it, thinking it was gold." "Yes," answered Tal, though it is doubtful if he understood all that Tom said, as it was half Spanish and half English. But the Indian knew a little English, too. "Valdez, when he find no gold, is very mad. Only papers in the yellow silk, papers with queer marks on. Valdez think it may be a charm to work evil, so he burned them up, all up." "Burned the rare map," gasped Tom. "All in fire," went on Tal, indicating by his hands the play of flames. "Valdez throw away yellow silk, and I take for my arrow so rain not wash off poison. I give to you, if you like, with blowgun." "No, thank you," answered Tom in disappointed tones. "The oiled silk is of no use without the map, and that's gone." "Whew, but this is tough," he said to his chum. "As long as it was only stolen, there was a chance to get it back. But if it's burned, the jig is up." "It looks so," agreed Ned. "We'd better get back and tell the professor. If he can't get along without the map, it's time he started a movement toward getting another. So it wasn't Beecher, after all, who got it." "Evidently not," assented Tom, "but I believe him capable of it." "You haven't much use for him," remarked Ned. "Huh," was all the answer given by his chum. "I am sorry, senors," went on Tal, "but I could not stop Valdez, and the burning of the papers—" "No, you could not help it," interrupted the young inventor. "But it just happens that it brings bad luck to us. You see, Tal, the papers in this yellow covering told of an old buried city that the bald-headed professor, the man with no hair on his head, is very anxious to discover. It is somewhere under the ground," and he waved to the jungle all about them, pointing earthwards. "Paper Valdez burned tell of lost city?" asked Tal, his face lighting up. "Yes, but now, of course, we can't tell where to dig for it." The Indian turned to his wife and talked rapidly with her in their own dialect. She, too, seemed greatly excited, making quick gestures. Finally, she ran out of the hut. "Where's she going?" asked Tom suspiciously. "To get her grandfather. He very old Indian. He know story of buried cities under trees. Very old story. What you call legend, maybe? But Gosal know. He tell same as his grandfather told him. You wait. Gosal come, and you listen." "Good, Ned," suddenly cried Tom. "Maybe we'll get on the track of lost Curzon after all, through some ancient Indian legend. Maybe we won't need the map." "It hardly seems possible," said Ned slowly. "What can these Indians know of buried cities that were out of existence before Columbus came here? Why, they haven't any written history." "No, and that may be just the reason they are more likely to be right," returned Tom. "Legends handed down from one grandfather to another go back a good many hundred years. If they were written, they might be destroyed as the professor's map was. Somehow or other, though I can't tell why, I begin to see daylight ahead of us." "I wish I did," remarked Ned. "Here comes Gosal, I think," murmured Tom, and he pointed to an Indian, bent with the weight of years, who, led by Tal's wife, was slowly approaching the hut. Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 21. The Cavern. "Now Gosal can tell you," said Tal, evidently pleased that he had, in a measure, solved the problem caused by the burning of the professor's map. "Gosal very old Indian. He know old stories, legends, very old." "Well, if he can tell us how to find the buried city of Curzon and the things in it," said Tom, "he's all right." The aged Indian proceeded slowly toward the hut where the impatient youth awaited him. "I know what you seek in the buried city," remarked Tal. "Do you?" cried Tom, wondering if someone had indiscreetly spoken of the idol of gold. "Yes, you want pieces of rock with strange writings on them, old weapons, broken pots. I know. I have helped white men before." "Yes, those are the things we want," agreed Tom, with a glance at his chum. "That is, some of them. But does your wife's grandfather talk our language?" "No, but I can tell you what he says." By this time the old man, led by Mrs. Tal, as the young man called the wife of the Indian they had helped, entered the hut. He seemed nervous and shy, and glanced from Tom and Ned to his grandson-in-law as the latter talked rapidly in the Indian dialect. Then Gosal made answer, but what it was all about the boys could not tell. "Gosal say," translated Tal, "that he know a story of a very old city away down underground." "Tell us about it," urged Tom eagerly. But a difficulty soon developed. Tal's intentions were good, but he was not equal to the task of translating, nor was the understanding of Tom and Ned of Spanish quite up to the mark. "Say, this is too much for me," exclaimed Tom. "We are losing the most valuable part of this by not understanding what Gosal says and what Tal translates." "What can we do?" asked Ned. "Get the professor here as soon as possible. He can manage this dialect, and he'll get the information at first hand. If Gosal can tell where to begin excavating for the city, he ought to tell the professor, not us." "That's right," agreed Ned. "We'll bring the professor here as soon as we can." Accordingly, they stopped the somewhat difficult task of listening to the translated story and told Tal, as well as they could, that they would bring the man with no hair on his head to listen to the tale. This seemed to suit the Indians, all of whom in the small colony appeared to be very grateful to Tom and Ned for having saved the life of Tal. "That was a good shot you made when you bowed over the jaguar," said Ned as the two young explorers started back to their camp. "Better than I realized, if it leads to the discovery of Curzon and the idol of gold," remarked Tom. "And to think we should come across the oiled silk holding the poisoned arrows," went on Ned. "That's the strangest part of the whole affair. If it hadn't been that you shot the jaguar, this never would have come about." That Professor Bumper was astonished, and Mr. Damon likewise, when they heard the story of Tom and Ned, is stating it mildly. "Come on," exclaimed the scientist as Tom finished. "We must go see this Gosal at once. If my map is destroyed, and it seems to be, this old Indian may be our only hope. Where did he say the buried city was, Tom?" Somewhere in this vicinity, as nearly as I can make out. But you'd better talk with him yourself. We didn't say anything about the idol of gold." "That's right. It's just as well to let the natives think we are only after ordinary relics."
"Bless my insurance policy," gasped Mr. Damon. "It does not seem possible that we are on the right track."
"Well, I think we are, from what little information Gusal gave us," remarked Tom. "This buried city of his must be a wonderful place." "It is, if it is what I take it to be," agreed the professor. "I told you I would bring you to a land of wonders, Tom Swift, and they have hardly begun yet. Come, I am anxious to talk to Gusal." In order that the Indians in the Bumper camp might not hear rumors of the new plan to locate the hidden city, and at the same time to keep rumors from spreading to the camp of the rivals, the scientist and his friends started a new shaft and put a shift of men at work on it. "We'll pretend we are on the right track and very busy," said Tom. "That will fool Beecher."
"Are you glad to know he did not take your map, Professor Bumper?"
asked Mr. Damon. "Well, yes, it is hard to believe such things of a fellow scientist." "If he didn't take it, he wanted to," said Tom, "and he has done, or will do, things as unsportsmanlike." "Oh, you are hardly fair, perhaps, Tom," commented Ned. Was all the answer he received. With the Indians in camp busy on the excavation work, and having ascertained that similar work was going on in the Beecher outfit, Professor Bumper, with Mr. Damon and the young men, set off to visit the Indian village and listen to Gusal's story. They passed the place where Tom had slain the jaguar, but nothing was left but the bones, the ants, vultures, and jungle animals having picked them clean in the night. On the arrival of Tom and his friends at the Indian's hut, Gusal told, in language which Professor Bumper could understand, the ancient legend of the buried city as he had heard it from his grandfather. "But is that all you know about it, Gusal?" asked the savant. "No, learned one. It is true most of what I have told you was told to me by my father and his father's father. But I myself, with these eyes, have looked upon the lost city." "You have?" cried the professor, this time in English. "Where? When? Take us to it. How do you get there?" "Through the cavern of the dead," was the answer when the questions were modified.
"Bless my diamond ring!" exclaimed Mr. Damon, when Professor Bumper translated the reply. "What does he mean?"
And then, after some talk, this information came out. Years before, when Gusal was a young man, he had been taken by his grandfather on a journey through the jungle. They stopped one day at the foot of a high mountain, and, clearing away the brush and stones at a certain place, an entrance to a great cavern was revealed. This, it appeared, was the Indian burial ground, and had been used for generations. Gusal, though in fear and trembling, was led through it, and came to another cavern, vaster than the first, and there he saw strange and wonderful sights, for it was the remains of a buried city that had once been the home of a great and powerful tribe, unlike the Indians, the ancient Mayas, it would seem. "Can you take us to this cavern?" asked the professor. "Yes," answered Gusal. "I will lead to it those who saved the life of Tal. Them and their friends. I will take you to the lost city."
"Good!" cried Mr. Damon when this had been translated. "Now let Beecher try to play any more tricks on us. Ho for the cavern and the lost city of Curzon."
"And the idol of gold," said Tom Swift to himself. "I hope we can get it ahead of Beecher. Perhaps if I can help in that. Ah, well, here's hoping, that's all." And a little smile curved his lips. Greatly excited by the strange news, but maintaining as calm an air outwardly as possible, so as not to excite the Indians, Tom and his friends returned to camp to prepare for their trip. Gusal had said the cavern lay distant more than 2 days' journey into the jungle. Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 22. The Storm. "Now," remarked Tom, once they were back again in their camp, "we must go about this trip to the cavern in a way that will cause no suspicion over there as to what our object is, and he nodded in the direction of the quarters of his rival. "Do you mean to go off quietly?" asked Ned. "Yes, and to keep the work going on here at these shafts," put in the scientist, "so that if any of their spies happen to come here they will think we still believe the buried city to be just below us. To that end we must keep the Indians digging, though I am convinced now that it is useless." Accordingly, preparations were made for an expedition into the jungle under the leadership of Gusal. Tal had not sufficiently recovered from the jaguar wounds to go with the party, but the old man, in spite of his years, was hale and hearty and capable of withstanding hardships. One of the most intelligent of the Indians was put in charge of the digging gangs as foreman, and told to keep them at work and not to let them stray. Tolpak, whose brother Tom had tried to save, proved a treasure. He agreed to remain behind and look after the interests of his friends, and see that none of their baggage or stores was taken. "Well, I guess we are ready as we ever shall be," remarked Tom, as the cavalcade made ready to start. Mules carried the supplies that were to be taken into the jungle, and others of the sturdy animals were to be ridden by the travelers. The trail was not an easy one, Gusal warned them. Tom and his friends found it even worse than they had expected, for all their experience in jungle and mountain traveling. In places it was necessary to dismount and lead the mules along, sometimes pushing and dragging them. More than once the trail fairly hung on the edge of some almost bottomless gorge, and again it wound its way between great walls of rock, so poised that they appeared about to topple over and crush the travelers. But they kept on, with dogged patience, through many hardships. To add to their troubles, they seemed to have entered the abode of the fiercest mosquitoes encountered since coming to Honduras. At times it was necessary to ride along with hats covered with mosquito netting and hands encased in gloves. They had taken plenty of condensed food with them, and they did not suffer in this respect. Game, too, was plentiful, and the electric rifles of Tom and Ned added to the larder. One night, after a somewhat sound sleep induced by hard travel on the trail that day, Tom awoke to hear someone or something moving about among their goods, which included their provisions. "Who's there?" asked the young inventor sharply as he reached for his electric rifle. There was no answer but a rattling of pans. "Speak or I'll fire," Tom warned, adding this in such Spanish as he could muster, for he thought it might be one of the Indians. No reply came. And then, seeing by the light of the stars a dark form moving in front of the tent, occupied by himself and Ned, Tom fired. There was a combined grunt and squeal of pain, then a savage growl, and Ned yelled, "What's the matter, Tom?" for he had been awakened and heard the crackle of the electrical discharge. "I don't know," Tom answered, "but I shot something or somebody." "Maybe some of Beecher's crowd," ventured his chum. But when they got their electric torches and focused them on the inert black object, it was found to be a bear which had come to nose about the camp for dainty morsels. Bruin was quite dead, and as he was in prime condition, there was a feast of bear meat at the following dinner. The white travelers found it rather too strong for their palates, but the Indians reveled in it. It was shortly after noon the next day when Gosel, after remarking that a storm seemed brewing, announced that they would be at the entrance of the cavern in another hour. "Good!" cried Professor Bumper. "At last we are near the buried city." "Don't be too sure," advised Mr. Damon. "We may be disappointed, though I hope not for your sake, my dear Professor." Gusal now took the lead, and the old Indian, traveling on foot, for he said he could better look for the old landmark that way than on the back of a mule, walked slowly along a rough cliff. "Here somewhere is the entrance to the cavern," said the aged man. "It was many years ago that I was here, many years, but it seems as though yesterday. It has little changed." Indeed, little did change in that land of wonders. Only nature caused what alterations there were. The hand of man had long been absent. Slowly Gusal walked along the rocky trail. On one side a sheer rock, towering 100 feet or more toward the sky. On the other side a deep gash, leading to a great fertile valley below. Suddenly the old man paused and looked about him as though uncertain. Then, more slowly still, he put out his hand and pulled at some bushes that grew on a ledge of the rock. They came away, having no depth of earth, and a small opening was disclosed. "It is here," said Gosell quietly, "the entrance to the cavern that leads to the burial place of the dead, in the city that is dead also. It is here." He stood aside while the others hurried forward. It took but a few minutes to prove that he was right, at least as to the existence of the cavern, for the four men were soon peering into the opening. "Come on," cried Tom impetuously. "Wait a moment," suggested the professor. "Sometimes the air in these places is foul. We must test it." But a torch one of the Indians threw in burned with a steady glow. That test was conclusive at least. They made ready to enter. Torches of a light bark that glowed with a steady flame and little smoke had been provided, as well as a good supply of electric dry battery lamps, and the way into the cavern was thus well lighted. At first the Indians were afraid to enter, but a word or two from Gosell reassured them, and they followed Professor Bumper, Tom, and the others into the cavern. For several hundred feet there was nothing remarkable about the cave. It was like any other cavern of the mountains, though wonderful for the number of crystal formations on the roof and walls, formations that sparkled like a million diamonds in the flickering light. "Talk about a wonderland," cried Tom. "This is fairyland." A moment later, as Gosell walked on beside the professor and Tom, the aged Indian came to a pause and, pointing ahead, murmured, "The city of the dead." They saw the niches cut in the rock walls, niches that held the countless bones of those who had died many, many years before. It was a vast Indian grave. "Doubtless a wealth of material of historic interest here," said Professor Bumper, flashing his torch on the skeletons. "But it will keep. Where is the city you spoke of, Gosell?" "Further on, Señor. Follow me." Past the stone graves they went, deeper and deeper into the great cave. Their footsteps echoed and re-echoed. Suddenly Tom, who with Ned had gone a little ahead, came to a sudden halt and said, "Well, this may be a burial place sure enough, but I think I see something alive all right, if it isn't a ghost." He pointed ahead. Surely those were lights flickering and moving about. And yes, there were men carrying them. The Bumper party came to a surprised halt. The other lights advanced, and then, to the great astonishment of Professor Bumper and his friends, there confronted them in the cave several scientists of Professor Beecher's party and a score or more of Indians. Professor Hylop, who was known to Professor Bumper, stepped forward and asked sharply, "What are you doing here?" "I might ask you the same thing," was the retort. "You might, but you would not be answered," came sharply. "We have a right here, having discovered this cavern, and we claim it under the concession of the Honduras government. I shall have to ask you to withdraw." "Do you mean leave here?" asked Mr. Damon. "That is it, exactly. We first discovered this cave. We have been conducting explorations in it for several days, and we wish no outsiders." "Are you speaking for Professor Beecher?" asked Tom. "I am, but he is here in the cave and will speak for himself if you desire it. But I represent him, and I order you to leave. If you do not go peaceably, we will use force. We have plenty of it." And he glanced back at the Indians grouped behind him, scowling, savage Indians. "We have no wish to intrude," observed Professor Bumper, "and I fully recognize the right of prior discovery. But one member of our party, he did not say which one, was in this cave many years ago. He led us to it." "Ours is a government concession," exclaimed Professor Hylop harshly. "We want no intruders. Go." And he pointed toward the direction whence Tom's party had come. "Drive them out," he ordered the Indians in Spanish, and with muttered threats the dark-skinned men advanced toward Tom and the others. "You need not use force," said Professor Bumper. He and Professor Hylop had quarreled bitterly years before on some scientific matter, and the matter was afterward found to be wrong. Perhaps this made him vindictive. Tom stepped forward and started to protest, but Professor Bumper interposed. "I guess there is no help for it but to go. It seems to be theirs by right of discovery and government concession," he said in disappointed tone. "Come, friends," and dejectedly they retraced their steps. Followed by the threatening Indians, the Bumper party made its way back to the entrance. They had hoped for great things, but if the cavern gave access to the buried city, the ancient city of Crozon, on the chief altar of which stood the golden idol Quetzal, it looked as though they were never to enter it. "We'll have to get our Indians and drive these fellows out," declared Tom. "I'm not going to be beaten this way by Beecher." "It is galling," declared Professor Bumper. "Still, he has right on his side, and I must give in to priority, as I would expect him to. It is the unwritten law." "Then we failed?" cried Tom bitterly. "Not yet," said Professor Bumper. "If I cannot unearth that buried city, I may find another in this wonderland. I shall not give up." "Hark! What's that noise?" asked Tom as they approached the entrance to the cave. "Sounds like a great wind blowing," commented Ned. It was. As they stood in the entrance, they looked out to find a fierce storm raging. The wind was sweeping down the rocky trail. The rain was falling in veritable bucketfuls from the overhanging cliff, and deafening thunder and blinding lightning roared and flashed. "Surely you would not drive us out in this storm," said Professor Bumper to his former rival. "You cannot stay in the cave. You must get out," was the answer, as a louder crash of thunder than usual seemed to shake the very mountain. Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 23. Entombed Alive. For an instant Tom and his friends paused at the entrance to the wonderful cavern and looked at the raging storm. It seemed madness to venture out into it, yet they had been driven from the cave by those who had every right of discovery to say who and who should not partake of its hospitality. "We can't go out into that blow," cried Ned. "It's enough to loosen the very mountains." "Let's stay here and defy them," murmured Tom. If what we seek is here, we have as good a right to it as they have." "We must go out," said Professor Bumper simply. "I recognize the right of my rival to dispossess us." "He may have the right, but it isn't human," said Mr. Damon. "Bless my overshoes, if Beecher himself were here he wouldn't have the heart to send us out in this storm." "I would not give him the satisfaction of appealing to him," remarked Professor Bumper. "Come, we will go out. We have our ponchos, and we are not fair-weather explorers. If we can't get to the lost city one way, we will another. Come, my friends." And despite the downpour, the deafening thunder, and the lightning that seemed ready to sear one's eyes, he walked out of the cave entrance, followed by Tom and the others. "Come on," cried Tom, in a voice he tried to render confident, as they went out into the terrible storm. "We'll beat 'em yet." The rain fell harder than ever. Small torrents were now rushing down the trail, and it was only a question of a few minutes before the place where they stood would be a raging river. So quickly does the rain collect in the mountains and speed towards the valleys. "We must take to the forest," cried Tom. "There'll be some shelter there, and I don't like the way the geography of this place is behaving. There may be a landslide at any moment." As he spoke, he motioned upward through the mist of the rain to the sloping side of the mountain towering above them. Loose stones were beginning to roll down, accompanied by patches of earth loosened by the water. Some of the patches carried with them bunches of grass and small bushes. "Yes, it will be best to move into the jungle," said the professor. "Kusal, you had better take the lead." It was wonderful to see how well the aged Indian bore up in spite of his years, and walked on ahead. They had left their mules tethered some distance back in a sheltering clump of trees, and they hoped the animals would be safe. The guide found a place where they could leave the trail, though going down a dangerous slope, to take to the forest. As carefully as possible they descended this, the rain continuing to fall, the wind to blow, the lightning to sizzle all about them, and the thunder to boom in their ears. They went on until they were beneath the shelter of the thick jungle growth of trees, which kept off some of the pelting drops. "This is better," exclaimed Ned, shaking his poncho and getting rid of some of the water that had settled on it. "Bless my overcoat," cried Mr. Damon. "We seem to have gotten out of the frying pan into the fire." "How?" asked Tom. "We are partly sheltered here, though had we stayed in the cave in spite of—" A devastating crash interrupted him, and, followed by the flash, one of the giant trees of the forest was seen to blaze up and then topple over. "Struck by lightning!" yelled Ned. "Yes, and it may happen to us," exclaimed Mr. Damon. "We were safer from the lightning in the open. Maybe—" Again came an interruption, but this time a different one. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to be shaking and trembling. "What is it?" gasped Ned, while Saul fell on his knees and began fervently to pray. "It's an earthquake!" yelled Tom Swift. As he spoke, there came another sound, the sound of a mass of earth in motion. It came from the direction of the mountain trail they had just left. They looked toward it, and their horror-stricken eyes saw the whole side of the mountain sliding down. Slowly at first the earth slid down, but constantly gathering force and speed. In the face of this new disaster the rain seemed to have ceased, and the thunder and lightning to be less severe. It was as though one force of nature gave way to the other. "Look, look!" gasped Ned. In the silence, which was broken now only by a low and ominous rumble, more menacing than had been the awful fury of the elements, the travelers looked. Suddenly there was a quicker movement of seemingly one whole section of the mountain. Great rocks and trees, carried down by the appalling force of the landslide, were slipping over the trail, obliterating it as though it had never existed. "There goes the entrance to the cavern!" cried Ned. And as the others looked to where he pointed, they saw the hole in the side of the mountain, the mouth of the cave that led to the lost city of Curzon, completely covered by thousands of tons of earth and stones. "That's the end of them!" exclaimed Tom as the rumble of the earthquake died away. Ned stopped, his eyes staring. "Of Professor Beecher's party. They're entombed alive." Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 24. The Revolving Stone. Stunned not alone by the realization of the awfulness of the fate of their rivals, but also by the terrific storm and the effects of the earthquake and the landslide, Tom and his friends remained for a moment gazing toward the mouth of the cavern, now completely out of sight, buried by a mass of broken trees, tangled bushes, rocks, and earth. Somewhere far beyond that mass was the Beecher party, held prisoner in the cave that formed the entrance to the buried city. Tom was the first to come to the realization of what was needed to be done. "We must help them," he exclaimed, and it was characteristic of him that he harbored no enmity. "How?" asked Ned. "We must get a force of Indians and dig them out," was the prompt answer. At Tom's vigorous words, Professor Bumper's forces were engaged into action, and he stated, "Fortunately, we have plenty of excavating tools. We may be in time to save them. Come on." The storm seemed to have passed as suddenly as it came up, and the earthquake, which after all did not cover a wide area, seems to be over. We must start the work of rescue at once. We must go back to camp and get all the help we can muster. The storm, indeed, seemed to be over, but it was no easy matter to get back over the soggy, rain-soaked ground to the trail they had left to take shelter in the forest. Fortunately, the earthquake had not involved that portion where they had left their mules, but most of the frightened animals had broken loose, and it was some little time before they could all be caught. "It is no use to try to get back to camp tonight," said Tom, when the last of the pack and saddle animals had been corralled. "It is getting late, and there is no telling the condition of the trail. We must stay here until morning." "But what about them?" and Mr. Damon nodded in the direction of the entombed ones. "We can help them best by waiting until the beginning of a new day," said the professor. "We shall need a large force, and we could not bring it up tonight. Besides, Tom is right, and if we tried to go along the trail after dark, torn and disturbed as it is bound to be by the rain, we might get into difficulties ourselves. No, we must camp here until morning and then go for help." They all decided finally this was best. The professor, too, pointed out that their rivals were in a large and roomy cave, not likely to suffer from lack of air nor food or water, since they must have supplies with them. "The only danger is that the cave has been crushed in," added Tom, "but in that event we would be of no service to them anyhow." The night seemed very long, and it was a most uncomfortable one, because of the shock and exertions through which the party had passed. Added to this was the physical discomfort caused by the storm. But in time there was a light in the east that meant morning was at hand, and with it came action. A hasty breakfast, cups of steaming coffee, forming a most welcome part, put them all in better condition, and once more they were on their way, heading back to the main camp where they had left their force of Indians. "My!" exclaimed Tom as they made their way slowly along. "It surely was some storm. Look at those big trees uprooted over there. They're almost as big as the giant redwoods of California, and yet they were bowed over as if they were tenpins." "I wonder if the wind did it, or the earthquake," ventured Mr. Damon. "No wind could do that," declared Ned. "It must have been the landslide caused by the earthquake. The wind could do it if the ground was made soft by the rain, and that was probably what did it," suggested Tom. "There is no harm in settling the point," commented Professor Bumper. "It is not far off our trail, and will take only a few minutes to go over to the trees. I should like to get some photographs to accompany an article that perhaps I shall write on the effects of sudden and severe tropical storms. We will go back and look at the overturned trees, and then we'll hurry on to camp to get the rescue party." The uprooted trees lay on one side of the mountain trail, perhaps a mile from the mouth of the cave, which had been covered over, entombing the Beecher party. Leaving the mules in charge of one of the Indians, Professor Bumper and his friends, accompanied by Goosal, approached the fallen trees. As they neared them, they saw that in falling the trees had lifted with their roots a large mass of earth and embedded rocks that had clung to the twisted and gnarled fibers. The mass was as large as a house. "Look at the hole when the roots pulled out," cried Ned. "Why, it's like the crater of a small volcano," he added. And as they stood on the edge of it, looking curiously at the hole made, the others agreed with Tom's chum. Professor Bumper was looking about, trying to ascertain if there were any evidences of the earthquake in the vicinity, when Tom, who had cautiously gone a little way down into the excavation caused by the fallen trees, uttered a cry of surprise. "Look!" he shouted. "Isn't that some sort of tunnel or underground passage?" And he pointed to a square opening, perhaps 7 feet high and nearly as broad, which extended, no one knew where, downward and onward from the side of the hole made by the uprooting of the trees. "It's an underground passage, all right," said Professor Bumper eagerly, "and not a natural one either. That was fashioned by the hand of man. If I am any judge, it seems to go right under the mountain, too. Friends, we must explore this. It may be of the utmost importance. Come, we have our electric torches, and we shall need them, for it is very dark in there." And he peered into the passage in front of which they all stood now. It seemed to have been tunneled through the earth, the sides being lined by either slabs of stone or walls made by a sort of concrete. "But what about the rescue work?" asked Mr. Damon. "I am not forgetting Professor Beecher and his friends," answered the scientist. "Perhaps this may be a better means of rescuing them than by digging them out, which will take a week at least," observed Tom. "This is a better way?" asked Ned, pointing to the tunnel. "That's it," confirmed the savant. "If you will notice, it extends back in the direction of the cave from which we were driven. Now, if there is a buried city beneath all this jungle, this mountain of earth and stones, the accumulation of centuries, it is probably on the bottom of some vast cavern. It is my opinion that we were only in one end of that cavern, and this may be the entrance to another end of it." "Then," asked Mr. Damon, "do you mean that we can enter here, get into the cave that contains the buried city or part of it, and find there Beecher and his friends?" "That's it. It is possible. And if we could, it would save an immense lot of work, and probably be a surer way to save their lives than by digging a tunnel through the landslide to find the mouth of the cave where we first entered." "It's a chance worth taking," said Mr. Damon. "Of course, it is a chance, but then everything connected with this expedition is, so no one is worse than another. As you say, we may find the entombed men more easily this way than any other." "I wonder," said Tom slowly, "if by any chance we shall find through this passage the lost city we are looking for." "And the idol of gold," added Ned. "Goosal, do you know anything about this?" asked Professor Bumper. "Did you ever hear of another passage leading to the cave where you saw the ancient city?" "No, learned one though I have heard stories about there being many cities, or parts of a big one, beneath the mountain, and when it was above ground, there were many entrances to it." "That settles it," cried the professor in English, having talked to Gosal in Spanish. We'll try this and see where it leads." They entered the stone-lined passage in spite of the fact that it had probably been buried and concealed from light and air for centuries, as evidenced by the growth of the giant trees above it. The air was fresh. "And this is one reason," said Tom, in commenting on this fact, "why I believe it leads to some vast cavern which is connected in some fashion with the outer air. Well, perhaps we shall soon make a discovery." Eagerly and anxiously the little party pressed forward by the light of the pocket electric lamps. They were obsessed by two thoughts: what they might find and the necessity for aiding in the rescue of their rivals. On and on they went, the darkness illuminated only by the torches they carried. But they noticed that the air was still fresh, and that a gentle wind blew toward them. The passage was undoubtedly artificial, a tunnel made by the hands of men now long crumbled into dust. It had a slightly upward slope, and this, Professor Bumper said, indicated that it was bored upward and perhaps into the very heart of the mountain, somewhere in the interior of which was the Beecher party. Just how far they went they did not know, but it must have been more than 2 miles. Yet they did not tire, for the way was smooth. Suddenly Tom, who, with Professor Bumper, was in the lead, uttered a cry as he held his torch above his head and flashed it about in a circle. "We're blocked!" he exclaimed. "We're up against a stone wall." It was but too true. Confronting them and extending from side to side across the passage and from roof to floor was a great rough stone. Immense and solid it seemed when they pushed on it in vain. "Nothing short of dynamite will remove that," said Ned in despair. "This is a blind lead. We'll have to go back." "But there must be something on the other side of that stone," cried Tom. "See, it is pierced with holes, and through them comes a current of air. If we could only move the stone." "I believe it is an ancient door," remarked Professor Bumper. Eagerly and frantically they tried to move it by their combined weight. The stone did not give the fraction of the breadth of a hair. "We'll have to go back and get some of your big tunnel blasting powder, Tom," suggested Ned. As they spoke, old Gosal glided forward. He had remained behind them in the passage while they were trying to move the rock. Now he said something in Spanish. "What does he mean?" asked Ned. "He asks that he be allowed to try," translated Professor Bumper. "Sometimes, he says, there is a secret way of opening stone doors in these underground caves. Let him try." Gosal seemed to be running his fingers lightly over the outer edge of the door. He was muttering to himself in his Indian tongue. Suddenly he uttered an exclamation, and, as he did so, there was a noise from the door itself. It was a grinding, scraping sound, a rumble, as though the rocks were being rolled one against the other. Then the astonished eyes of the adventurers saw the great stone door revolve on its axis and swing to one side, leaving a passage open through which they could pass. Gosal had discovered the hidden mechanism. What lay before them? Tom Swift in the Land of Wonders by Victor Appleton. Chapter 25. The Idol of Gold. "Forward!" cried Tom Swift. "Where?" asked Mr. Damon, hanging back for an instant. "Bless my compass, Tom, do you know where you are going?" "I haven't the least idea, but it must lead to something, or the ancients who made this revolving stone door wouldn't have taken such care to block the passage." "Ask Gosal if he knows anything about it," suggested Mr. Damon to the professor. "He says he never was here before," translated the savant. "But years ago, when he went into the hidden city by the cave we left yesterday, he saw doors like this, which opened this way." "Then we're on the right track," cried Tom. "If this is the same kind of door, it must lead to the same place. Ho for Gosal and the Idol of Gold." As they passed through the stone door, Tom and Professor Bumper tried to get some idea of the mechanism by which it worked, but they found this impossible, it being hidden within the stone itself, or in the adjoining walls. But in order that it might not close of itself and entomb them, the portal was blocked open with stones found in the passage. "It's always well to have a line of retreat open," said Tom. "There is no telling what might lie beyond us." For a time there seemed to be nothing more than the same passage along which they had come. Then the passage suddenly widened, like the large end of a square funnel. Upward and outward the stone walls swept, and they saw dimly before them, in the light of their torches, a vast cavern, seemingly formed by the falling in of mountains, which, in toppling over, had met overhead in a sort of rough arch, thus protecting, in a great measure, that which lay beneath them. Kusal, who had brought with him some of the fiber-bark torches, set a bundle of them aflame. As they flared up, a wondrous sight was revealed to Tom Swift and his friends. Stretching out before them, as though they stood at the end of an elevated street and gazed down on it, was a city. A large city, with streets, houses, open squares, temples, statues, fountains, dry for centuries. A buried and forgotten city. A city in ruins. A city of the dead. Now dry as dust, but still a city. Or, rather, the strangely preserved remains of one. "Look," whispered Tom. A louder voice just then would have seemed a sacrilege. "Look." "Is it what we are looking for?" asked Ned in a low voice. "I believe it is," replied the professor. "It is the lost city of Curzon, or one just like it. And now, if we can find the idol of gold, our search will be ended, at least a major part of it." "Where did you expect to find the idol?" asked Tom. "It should be in the main temple. Come, we will walk in the ancient streets where no feet but ours have trod in many centuries. Come." In eager silence they pressed on through this newly discovered wonderland, for it was a wonderful city, or had been, though much of it was in ruins, probably caused by an earthquake or an eruption from a volcano. The central portion, covered as it was by the overtoppling mountains that formed the arching roof, was well preserved. There were rude but beautiful stone buildings. There were archways, temples, public squares, and images, not at all beautiful, for they seemed to be of man-monsters, doubtless ancient gods. There were smoothly paved streets, wonderfully carved fountains, some in ruins, all now as dry as a bone, but which must have been places of beauty, where youths and maidens gathered in the ancient days. Of the ancient population there was not a trace left. Tom and his friends penetrated some of the houses, but not so much as a bone or a heap of moldering dust showed where the remains of the people were. Either they had fled at the approaching doom of the city and were buried elsewhere, or some strange fire or other force of nature had consumed and obliterated them. "What a wealth of historic information I shall find here," murmured Professor Bumper, as he caught sight of many inscriptions and strange characters on the walls and buildings. "I shall never get to the end of them." "But what about the idol of gold?" asked Mr. Damon. "Do you think you'll find that?" "We must hurry on to the temple over there," said the scientist, indicating a building further along. "And then we must see about rescuing our rivals, Professor," put in Tom. "Yes, Tom, but fortunately we are on the ground here before them," agreed the professor. Undoubtedly it was the chief temple, or place of worship, of the long-dead race, which the explorers now entered. It was a building beautiful in its barbaric style, and yet simple. There were massive walls and a great inner court, at the end of which seemed to be some sort of altar. And then, as they lighted fresh torches and pressed forward with them and their electric lights, they saw that which caused a cry of satisfaction to burst from all of them. The idol of gold. Yes, there it squatted, an ugly, misshapen figure, a cross between a toad and a Gila monster, half man, half beast, with big red eyes, rubies probably, that gleamed in the repulsive golden face, and the whole figure, weighing many pounds, seemed to be of solid gold. Eagerly the others followed Professor Bumper up the altar steps to the very throne of the golden idol. The scientist touched it, tried to raise it, and make sure of its solidity and material. "This is it," he cried. "It is the idol of gold I have found. We have found it, for it belongs to all of us. "Hooray!" cried Tom Swift, and Ned and Mr. Damon joined in the cry. There was no need for silence or caution now, and yet, as they stood about the squat and ugly figure which, in spite of its hideousness, was worth a fortune intrinsically and as an antique, they heard from the direction of the stone passage a noise. "What is that?" asked Tom Swift. There was a murmur of voices. "Indians!" cried Professor Bumper, recognizing the language, a mixture of Spanish and Indian. The cave was illuminated by the glare of the torches, which seemed to rush forward. A moment later it was seen that they were being carried by a number of Indians. "Friends," murmured Gusal, using the Spanish term amigos. "They are our own Indians," cried Tom Swift. "I see Tolpec," and he pointed to the native who had deserted from Washington's force to help them. "How did they get here?" asked Professor Bumper. It was quickly told. In their camp, where, under the leadership of Tolpec, they had been left to do the excavating, the natives had heard, seen, and felt the effects of the storm and the earthquake, though it did little damage in their vicinity. But they became alarmed for the safety of the professor and his party, and, at Tolpec's suggestion, set off in search of them. The Indians had seen, passing along the trail, the uprooted trees, and had noticed the footsteps of the explorers going down to the stone passage. It was easy for them to determine that Tom and his friends had gone in, since the marks of their boots were plainly in evidence in the soft soil. None of the Indians was as much wrought up over the discovery of Curzon and the idol as were the white adventurers. The gold, of course, meant something to the natives, but they were indifferent to the wonders of the underground city. Perhaps they had heard too many legends concerning such things to be impressed. "That statue is yours, all yours," said old Gosell, when he had talked with his relatives and friends among the natives. "They all say that you find you keep, and we will help you keep it." "That's good," murmured Professor Bumper. "There was some doubt in my mind as to our right to this. But after all, the natives who live in this land are the original owners, and if they pass title to us, it is clear. That settles the last difficulty." "Excepting that of getting the idol out," said Mr. Damon. "Oh, we'll accomplish that," cried Tom. "I can hardly believe my good luck," declared Professor Bumper. "I shall write a whole book on this idol alone, and then—" Once more came an interruption. This time it was from another direction, but it was of the same character, an approaching band of torch-bearers. They were Indians, too, but leading them was a number of whites, and at their head was no less personage than Professor Beecher himself. For a moment, as the three parties stood together in the ancient temple, in the glare of many torches, no one spoke. Then Professor Bumper found his voice. "We are glad to see you," he said to his rival. "That is, glad to see you alive, for we saw the landslide bury you, and we were coming to dig you out. We thought this cave, the cave of the buried city, would lead us to you easier than by digging through the slide. We have just discovered this idol," and he put his hand on the grim golden image. "Oh, you have discovered it, have you?" asked Professor Beecher, and his voice was bitter. "Yes, not 10 minutes ago. The natives have kindly acknowledged my right to it under the law of priority. I'm sorry, but—" With a look of disgust and chagrined disappointment on his face, Professor Beecher turned to the other scientist and said, "Let us go. We are too late. He has what I came after." "Well, it is the fortune of war and discovery," put in Mr. Hardy, one of the party, who seemed the least ill-natured. "Your luck might have been ours, Professor Bumper. I congratulate you." "Thank you. Are you sure your party is all right? Not in need of assistance? How did you get out of the place you were buried?" "Thank you. We do not require any help. It was good of you to think of us, but we got out the way we came in. We did not enter the tunnel as you did, but came in through another entrance, which was not closed by the landslide. Then we made a turn through a gateway in a tunnel connecting with ours, a gateway which seemed to have been opened by the earthquake, and we came here just now." "Too late, I see, to claim the discovery of the idol of gold," went on Mr. Hardy. but I trust you will be generous and allow us to make observations of the buildings and other relics." "As much as you please, and with your greatest pleasure in the world," was the prompt answer of Professor Bumper. "All I lay sole claim to is the golden idol. You are at liberty to take whatever else you find in Gozon, and to make what observations you like." "That is generous of you, and quite in contrast to the conduct of our leader. I trust he may awaken to a sense of the injustice he did you." But Professor Beecher was not there to hear this. He had stalked away in anger. "Humph," grunted Tom. Then he continued, "That story about a government concession was all a fake, Professor, else he'd have put up a fight now. Contemptible sneak." In fact, the story of Tom Swift's trip to the underground land of wonders is ended. For with the discovery of the idol of gold, the main object of the expedition was accomplished. But their adventures were not over by any means, though there is not room in this volume to record them. Suffice it to say that means were at once taken to get the golden image out of the cave of the ancient city. It was not accomplished without hard work, for the gold was heavy, and Professor Bumper would not naturally consent to the shaving off of so much as an ear or part of the flat nose, to say nothing of the half-dozen extra arms and legs with which the ugly idol was furnished. Finally it was safely taken out of the cave and along the stone passage to the opening formed by the overthrown trees, and thence on to camp. And at the camp a surprise awaited Tom. Some long-delayed mail had been forwarded from the nearest place of civilization, and there were letters for all, including several for our hero. One in particular he picked out first and read eagerly. "Well, is every little thing all right, Tom?" asked Ned, as he saw a cheerful grin spread itself over his chum's face. "I would say it is, and then some. Look here, Ned. This is a letter from, I know, Mary Nestor. Go on." "How did you guess?" "Oh, I'm a mind reader." "Huh? Well, you know she was away when I went to call to say goodbye, and I was a little afraid Beecher had got an inside edge on me." "Had he?" "No, but he tried hard enough. He went to see Mary in Fayetteville, just as you heard, before he came to join his party. But he didn't pay much of a visit to her." "No?" "No, Mary told him he'd better hurry along to Central America, or wherever it was he intended to going, as she didn't care for him as much as he flattered himself she did." "Good!" cried Ned. "Shake, old man, I'm glad." They shook hands. "Well, what's the matter? Didn't you read all of her letter?" asked Ned, when he saw his chum once more pursuing the epistle. "No, there's a postscript here. Sorry I couldn't see you before you left. It was a mistake. But when you come back—" "Oh, that part isn't any of your affair," and blushing under his tan, Tom thrust the letter into his pocket and strode away, while Ned laughed happily. With the idol of gold safe in their possession, Professor Bumper's party could devote their time to making other explorations in the buried city. This they did, as testified to by a long list of books and magazine articles since turned out by the scientists, dealing strictly with archaeological subjects, touching on the ancient Mayan race and its civilization with particular reference to their system of computing time. Professor Beecher, young and foolish, would not consent to delve into the riches of the ancient city, being too much chagrined over the loss of the idol. It seems he had really promised to give a part of it to Mary Nestor, but he never got the chance. His colleagues, after their first disappointment at being beaten, joined forces with Professor Bumper in exploring the old city, and made many valuable discoveries. In one point Professor Bumper had done his rival an injustice. That was in thinking Professor Beecher was responsible for the treachery of Juan Cinto. That was due to the plotter's own work. It was true that Professor Beecher had tentatively engaged Juan Cinto, and had sent word to him to keep other explorers out from the vicinity of the ancient city, if possible. But Juan Cinto, who did not return Professor Bumper's money, as he had promised, had acted treacherously in order to enrich himself. Professor Beecher had nothing to do with that, nor had he with the taking of the map. as has been seen, the loss of which, after all, was a blessing in disguise, for Curzon would never have been located by following the directions given there. As it was, very inaccurate. In another point, it was demonstrated that the old documents were at fault. This was in reference to the golden idol having been overthrown and another set up in its place, an act which had caused the destruction of Curzon. It is true that the city was destroyed, or rather buried, but this catastrophe was probably brought about by an earthquake, and another great idol, one of clay, was found, perhaps a rival of Quetzal, but it was this clay image which was thrown down and broken, and not the golden one. Perhaps an effort had been made, just before the burying of the city, to change idols and the system of worship, but Quetzal seems to have held his own. The old manuscripts were not very reliable, it was found, except in general. "Well, I guess this will hold Beecher for a while," said Tom, the night of the arrival of Mary's letter, and after he had written one in answer, which was dispatched by a runner to the nearest place whence mail could be forwarded. "Yes, luck seems to favor you," replied Ned. "You've had a hand in the discovery of the idol of gold and—" "Yes, and I discovered something else I wasn't quite sure of," interrupted Tom, as he felt to make sure he had a certain letter safe in his pocket. It was several weeks later that the explorations of Curzon came to an end, a temporary end, for the rainy season set in, when the tropics are unsuitable for white men. Tom, Professor Bumper, Ned, and Mr. Damon set sail for the United States, the valuable idol of gold safe on board, and there, with their vessel plowing the blue waters of the Caribbean Sea, we will take leave of Tom Swift and his friends. The end.